340 meters down in the East China Sea, cameras reveal something that shouldn't exist. The HIJMS Yamato, shattered into massive pieces scattered across the seafloor. But here's what makes this discovery so haunting. This wasn't just the largest battleship ever built. This was a suicide mission. On April 7, 1945, Imperial Japan sent the Yamato, 72,800 tons of steel, the most powerful warship ever constructed, on a one-way mission to Okinawa, with barely enough fuel to get there, and no fuel to return. They knew she wouldn't come back. The entire crew knew they were sailing to their deaths. 400 American aircraft attacked her in waves. 10 torpedoes struck her hull. 5 bombs penetrated her decks, and still the Yamato refused to die. For 2 hours, she fought back with everything she had. The largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship, anti-aircraft batteries that turned the sky into a wall of steel, a crew that knew they were already dead but kept fighting anyway. And then, at 2:23 p.m., her forward magazine exploded with such violence that the mushroom cloud was visible 100 miles away, and the shock wave was felt on ships 20 miles distant. The Yamato didn't just sink, she disintegrated. The explosion was so massive that it broke the ship into 3 main sections and scattered debris across hundreds of meters of seafloor. 3,055 men died, only 276 survived, and for 40 years, the Yamato rested in the East China Sea, the broken monument to Imperial Japan's desperation and the end of the battleship era. This is the story of the Yamato, the ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, the mission that was designed to fail, and the sacrifice that changed nothing. The HIJMS Yamato was laid down on November 4, 1937, at the Kure Naval Arsenal in absolute secrecy. Japan had withdrawn from the Washington and London naval treaties that limited battleship construction, and they were building something unprecedented. The Yamato would be the largest battleship ever constructed, not just in Japan, but in the world. She would be 263 meters, 862 feet long, displace over 72,800 tons fully loaded, and carry armament that no other ship could match. Her main battery consisted of 9 18.1-inch, 460 mm naval rifles, the largest guns ever mounted on a warship. Each gun was 21 meters long and weighed 162 tons. The shells weighed 3,200 pounds and could be fired over 25 miles with devastating accuracy. These guns were so massive that when they fired, the blast wave could kill anyone standing on deck within the danger zone. They were designed to penetrate the armor of any ship afloat and sink enemy battleships at ranges where the enemy couldn't fire back. But the Yamato wasn't just about firepower. She was armored like nothing else in the world. Her main belt armor was 16 inches thick, solid steel that was supposed to be impenetrable to shells from enemy battleships. Her turret faces were 25 inches thick. Her deck armor was designed to withstand bombs dropped from high altitude. The designers calculated that the Yamato could withstand hits that would sink any other battleship. She was supposed to be unsinkable. The construction was shrouded in secrecy. The Japanese erected massive screens around the dry dock so that no one could see what they were building. Workers were sworn to secrecy under threat of imprisonment. Aerial photography was prohibited in the area. The Japanese knew that if the Americans discovered they were building a super battleship that violated all treaty limits, it would cause an international incident. So the Yamato was built in secret, a ship so large and so powerful that Japan believed she could single-handedly change the balance of naval power in the Pacific. The Yamato was launched on August 8, 1940, and commissioned on December 16, 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. She immediately became the flagship of the combined fleet, the most powerful warship in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto moved his flag to the Yamato, commanding Japan's naval operations from the most powerful ship ever built. But here's the irony that would define the Yamato's entire career. She was built to fight the decisive battleship engagement that Japan's naval doctrine predicted would win the war. One massive battle where Japanese battleships would face American battleships and superior Japanese gunnery and armor would carry the day, except that battle never came. By 1942, naval warfare had changed. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, were the dominant force in the Pacific, and the Yamato, for all her power and armor, spent most of the war sitting in port, too valuable to risk in combat, becoming obsolete even as she was being completed. The Yamato's first major combat action came in June 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. She was part of Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet, and her role was to provide anti-aircraft support for the carriers and engage any American battleships that appeared. But the Battle of the Philippine Sea was decided by aircraft, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American carrier planes destroyed Japanese naval aviation. The Yamato fired her massive guns exactly 0 times at enemy ships. She served as an anti-aircraft platform, using her secondary batteries to try to defend against American planes, but her main guns, the largest naval rifles ever built, never engaged an enemy surface ship. In October 1944, the Yamato finally got her chance at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. She was part of Admiral Kurita's center force, tasked with breaking through to Leyte Gulf and destroying the American invasion fleet. On October 25, off Samar, the Yamato and her sister ships encountered Taffy 3, a group of American escort carriers and destroyers that had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This should have been the Yamato's moment. She was facing small escort carriers and destroyers, ships that her 18.1-inch guns could obliterate with a single hit. But the American destroyers and destroyer escorts did something extraordinary. They charged the Japanese battleships, launching desperate torpedo attacks and laying smoke screens. The Yamato fired her main guns at the USS Johnston and other American destroyers, but the small, fast-moving targets were difficult to hit, and Admiral Kurita, confused by the fierce American resistance and concerned about air attacks, ordered a retreat just as victory was within reach. The Yamato had finally fired her guns in anger at enemy ships, but she'd failed to achieve the decisive victory she was designed for. And after Leyte Gulf, it was clear to everyone, even the most optimistic Japanese officers, that the war was lost. American forces were advancing across the Pacific. Japan's navy was shattered. The Yamato was one of the few major warships still operational, but she was trapped in Japan with no fuel for operations and no strategic purpose. By early 1945, the situation was desperate. American forces had taken Iwo Jima and were preparing to invade Okinawa, the last stepping stone before the invasion of mainland Japan. The Japanese High Command knew Okinawa would fall. They knew the war was lost, but they couldn't accept surrender. So they began planning suicide operations, kamikaze attacks, banzai charges, and one final mission for the Yamato. Operation Tengo was conceived as a suicide mission from the beginning. The plan was simple. The Yamato, escorted by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, would sail to Okinawa and beach herself on the shore. She would become an unsinkable fortress, using her massive guns to destroy American ships and troops, until she ran out of ammunition or was destroyed. It was a one-way mission. The ships were given only enough fuel to reach Okinawa, not enough to return. The crew knew they were sailing to their deaths. On April 6, 1945, the Yamato and her escorts departed Tokuyama and headed south toward Okinawa. The fleet was detected almost immediately by American submarines, which radioed the position to the Pacific Fleet. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, ordered a massive airstrike. He would not allow the Yamato to reach Okinawa. Every available aircraft from Task Force 58's carriers would attack the Japanese force and sink it before it could threaten the invasion. April 7, 1945. Dawned clear with good visibility. Perfect weather for aerial attack. The Yamato's crew knew American planes were coming. They'd been at battle stations since before dawn. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries were manned and ready. Extra lookouts scanned the sky. Everyone aboard knew this was the day they would die, but they would die fighting. At 10 a.m., the first American aircraft appeared. The attacks came in waves. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters strafing the decks. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with exploding shells. Her main 18.1-inch guns were loaded with special beehive rounds, shells packed with incendiary shrapnel designed to destroy aircraft. It was an admission of reality. The largest naval guns ever built would never fight another battleship. They were being used as anti-aircraft weapons. The American attack was overwhelming. Over 400 aircraft from 11 carriers attacked the Yamato and her escorts. They came in from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinating their attacks to divide the Japanese defenses. Dive bombers would attack from high altitude, forcing the anti-aircraft guns to elevate, then torpedo bombers would come in low from the opposite side. The first torpedo struck the Yamato's port side at 12:32 p.m. Then another, and another. The American pilots had studied the Yamato's design and knew her weakness. Torpedo attacks on a single side would create asymmetric flooding that the ship couldn't counterflood. So they concentrated their attacks on the port side, hit after hit, each torpedo creating massive flooding that pulled the ship over. Bombs struck the deck, penetrating even the Yamato's thick armor. Fires broke out across the ship. The steering was damaged, making the ship difficult to control. Anti-aircraft crews were killed by strafing runs and bomb fragments. But the Yamato kept fighting. Her guns kept firing. Her crew kept working damage control. She absorbed punishment that would have sunk any other ship and kept fighting back. By 1:30 p.m., the Yamato had taken at least 8 torpedoes and multiple bomb hits. She was listing 15 degrees to port. Flooding was spreading through the hull faster than it could be contained. The engineering spaces were taking on water, but the ship was still making way, still fighting, still refusing to die. Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the operation from the Yamato, knew the ship was doomed. At 2:05 p.m., he ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship. He released the crew from their duty, allowing them to save themselves. But most stayed. The gun crews stayed at their posts. The damage control parties stayed in the flooding compartments. They had sailed on a suicide mission, and they would see it through. At 2:20 p.m., the Yamato took 2 more torpedoes on the port side. The flooding became catastrophic. The list increased to 20 degrees, then 25 degrees. The ship was rolling onto her side. Water was pouring into spaces that had never been designed to flood. And in the forward magazines, the armored compartments where hundreds of tons of ammunition and propellant were stored, the flooding reached critical levels. At 2:23 p.m., the Yamato's forward magazine exploded. The detonation was beyond anything the American pilots had ever witnessed. 400 tons of explosives, shells, powder charges, everything stored in the forward magazines, detonated simultaneously. The explosion tore the bow off the ship, sent a mushroom cloud rising thousands of feet into the air, and created a shock wave that was felt on American ships 20 miles away. Pilots flying over the explosion were thrown around by the blast wave. Some aircraft were damaged by debris thrown thousands of feet into the air. The explosion broke the Yamato's back. The forward section, everything forward of the first turret, simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the explosion. The midsection capsized and sank within minutes. The stern section, with the propellers still turning, floated briefly before sliding beneath the surface. The entire process, from magazine explosion to the last piece of wreckage disappearing, took less than 10 minutes. The shock wave from the explosion killed hundreds of men who'd abandoned ship and were floating in the water. The suction of the sinking pulled more underwater. Of the 2,767 men aboard the Yamato, 2,498 died. Only 269 survived, pulled from the water by the escorting destroyers that had also survived the attack. Admiral Ito went down with his ship, as did the Yamato's captain and most of the senior officers. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 escorting destroyers were also sunk in the attack. The entire Operation 10 Go, the last sortie of the Imperial Japanese Navy, resulted in the loss of 6 ships and over 3,700 men. The Yamato never fired a shot at Okinawa. She never got close to the island. She was destroyed exactly as American planners had intended, from the air by overwhelming force, before she could threaten the invasion fleet. The sinking of the Yamato marked the end of the battleship era. She was the last battleship ever sunk in combat. After April 7, 1945, no navy would ever again send battleships into combat, expecting them to survive against determined air attack. The Yamato, designed to be the ultimate battleship, proved that battleships were obsolete. Her death validated everything the carrier advocates had been arguing for 2 decades. For the Japanese survivors and the families of the dead, the Yamato's loss was a national tragedy. She had been the symbol of the Imperial Navy's power, the ship that was supposed to be unsinkable. Her destruction, so complete and so overwhelming, demonstrated that Japan had no hope of winning the war. The Yamato's mission had been suicide from the beginning, but her crew had sailed anyway, bound by duty and honor to a cause that was already lost. For 40 years, the Yamato rested in the East China Sea at approximately 340 meters depth. Her exact location was uncertain. The area where she'd sunk was large, and the violent explosion had scattered the wreckage. But in the 1980s, as deep-sea exploration technology advanced, Japanese researchers began searching for the Yamato. She was more than a shipwreck. She was a symbol of Japan's wartime experience, a monument to sacrifice and loss. In 1985, a Japanese survey ship located the Yamato's wreck using side-scan sonar. The discovery made international headlines. Subsequent expeditions documented the wreck's condition using remotely operated vehicles and underwater cameras. What they found was a ship that had been torn apart by the magazine explosion and the violence of sinking. The wreck is scattered across several hundred meters of seafloor. The bow section, or what's left of it, after the magazine explosion, lies separate from the main hull. The forward turrets, each weighing thousands of tons, had been thrown from the ship by the explosion. The middle section of the ship, including the massive bridge tower, lies on its side. The stern section, with the propellers still attached, rests nearby. The entire wreck field tells the story of catastrophic, violent destruction. The underwater footage revealed details that survivors had described but few had believed. The massive 18.1-inch gun barrels, still attached to the turrets, lying on the seafloor. The armor plating, designed to be impenetrable, torn like paper by the magazine explosion. The bridge structure, where Admiral Ito had commanded the ship's final battle, now collapsed and covered in marine growth. But what struck researchers most was the scale of the debris field. The Yamato hadn't just sunk, she'd been obliterated. The magazine explosion had released more energy than the bombs that would be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just months later. It had torn a 72-800-ton battleship into pieces and scattered them across the ocean floor like a child's broken toys. The wreck is now protected as a war grave. The Japanese government has designated it as such, and diving on the wreck without permission is prohibited. Over 2,400 men remain with the Yamato, entombed in the scattered sections of the ship. For the survivors and the families of the dead, the discovery of the wreck provided some closure. They finally knew where the Yamato rested. They could visit the site, hold memorial services, honor the dead. But the discovery also reignited debate about the Yamato's final mission. Was Operation Tengo a noble sacrifice, or a pointless waste of life? The crew had known they were sailing to their deaths. They'd been given a mission that was militarily meaningless. Even if the Yamato had reached Okinawa and beached herself, she would have been destroyed by American ships and aircraft within days. The operation would not change the outcome of the war. It would not save Japan from defeat. It was purely symbolic, a demonstration that Japan would fight to the bitter end, that the warrior spirit of the Imperial Navy was unbroken. Some historians argue that the Yamato's crew were heroes who followed their duty to the end. They'd been ordered on a suicide mission, and they'd accepted that order with courage and determination. They'd fought brilliantly against overwhelming odds, keeping the Yamato fighting for 2 hours against 400 aircraft. They'd demonstrated the best qualities of naval service: courage, discipline, sacrifice. Others argue that the Yamato's mission was a criminal waste of life. The Japanese High Command knew the war was lost. They knew the Yamato would be destroyed. They sent 3,700 men to their deaths for no military purpose, only to satisfy some abstract notion of honor. The crew members who died had families, children, lives that could have continued after the war. Instead, they were sacrificed for a mission that everyone knew would fail. The truth, as always, is complicated. The Yamato's crew were products of their time and culture. They'd been raised in a society that valued honor above life, Duty above self-preservation. They'd been taught that death in service to the emperor was the highest achievement. They sailed on a suicide mission, not because they were forced, but because refusing would have been unthinkable. They were brave, skilled, and ultimately doomed by a leadership that valued symbolism over lives. The Yamato's story also reveals the limitations of military power. She was the most powerful battleship ever built, the ultimate expression of naval engineering and firepower, but power is relative. Against 400 aircraft with modern torpedoes and bombs, even the mightiest battleship was helpless. The Yamato's armor, designed to stop shells from enemy battleships, couldn't stop torpedoes from punching holes below the waterline. Her anti-aircraft guns, numerous though they were, couldn't stop coordinated attacks from multiple directions. She was a dinosaur fighting mammals, powerful but obsolete, doomed by evolution rather than any inherent weakness. 340 meters down in the East China Sea, the HIJMS Yamato rests in pieces. The largest battleship ever built, scattered across the seafloor by a magazine explosion that ended the age of big guns and proved that aircraft carriers had made battleships obsolete. The ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, sent on a suicide mission, where success was defined not by victory, but by dying bravely. The 2,498 men who died with her remain at their posts, victims of a war that was already lost, and a military culture that valued death over surrender. The Yamato's wreck serves as a monument to multiple failures. The failure of battleship doctrine, the failure of leadership that sent men on suicide missions, and the failure of a military culture that couldn't adapt to changing warfare. But it's also a monument to the men who served aboard her, men who did their duty with courage and skill, who fought brilliantly against impossible odds, and who died because they'd been taught that honor was more important than life. The Yamato was supposed to change the war. Instead, she changed nothing. Okinawa fell, Japan surrendered. The battleship era ended, and 2,498 men, who might have rebuilt Japan in peace, died in a battle that accomplished nothing, except proving that courage alone cannot overcome obsolescence. 340 meters down. The evidence of that truth lies scattered across the seafloor. The broken pieces of the largest battleship ever built. The ship that proved battleships had no future. Destroyed by the weapon that defined naval warfare for the next 80 years. The aircraft,